And I just naively thought, this is going to pop off. I'll get some money from somewhere and then I'll become super successful and everyone will be talking about it and we'll change the needle on the way we talk about childhood sexual abuse. We're 3 years in. I'm only just getting to the point where I might be able to secure a year of salary for myself.
Yeah. That's the label they have rather than the professional experience and expertise they have. So people are saying, who have we got in the room? Well, we've got someone who's a real, a comms expert. We've got someone who is a lobbyist and, kind of campaigner. We've got a social worker. We've got someone, a therapist. Oh, and we've got a survivor.
I always say this, I should start tattooing it on me. I think there is nothing more dangerous than a person with many resources who thinks they are doing the right thing.
And the way we need to change that narrative is it needs to transform from a narrative of fatalism to a narrative of hope.
Hi, welcome to Secrets Worth Sharing, a series all about having difficult conversations on childhood sexual abuse, but with serious joy. I'm Sophia, the host of Secrets Worth Sharing, and today we are talking about working within the sector. And for that, we have the wonderful Sean. Hi, Sean.
Hi, Sophia.
Do you want to tell us a bit about who you are, what you do, why you're here to talk about this particular topic?
Sure, great. I mean, great to be here, to be able to have a conversation around what can be a difficult topic at times. Most recently, I was working with a funding organization. So we used to write checks. We used to give out money to tackle this problem. And we did that to organizations from around the world. And I'll tell you, Sophia, what I saw when I was doing that, and we looked at, because we saw amazing people come into us and pitch ideas and tell us what they're doing, and they're working in the community, or they're working to change kind of attitudes, or they're working to change policy. And they were amazing people, and they were doing amazing work. And when you looked at each of their projects, when you looked at what they were doing, it was making a huge difference to children's lives, a massive difference. But when I took a step back and talked to other funders who were also doing something similar and funding many times the same organizations and the same projects, we didn't see the dial moving overall in this problem, right? We saw huge amount of work, huge difference being made sort of locally. But if we looked at this across the world, why weren't we making more progress? And we asked ourselves that question. And it isn't through lack of passion. It isn't through lack of insight. It isn't through lack of commitment. And so what was it that stopped that progress being made? And I think there's lots of reasons for that. So one of those reasons is that if you talk to people about what is it that we need to do to end childhood sexual violence or child sexual abuse, one of the real challenges we found is that if you ask 5 people, you get 5 different answers.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay. And that makes it hard to be effective, not effective at an individual project level, but as a community or as a sector or as a field. It makes it really hard to be effective because we all don't agree, or we hasn't come together to have this conversation and decide together what we need to do. How do we combine our efforts and how we kind of support the work of each other, not just me or you, but us together. What do we all agree on needs to happen? We just didn't see that. And that kind of led to one of the other problems around this issue and being more effective and making more of a difference. We were a private funding organization. We were set up by an individual who deeply cared about children and about this issue. And we talked to others, for example, Oak Foundation. We were a Human Dignity Foundation, 2 of the organizations to fund in this space. But we didn't see enough other funders coming in. And we know the impact that has at a local community level. We know all of the people on the ground doing the real work. I wasn't doing any work. I was doing some evaluations. I was doing, kind of like doing some assessments. I was helping write some checks. But I wasn't doing the work. It was the people we're funding are the heroes. And we tried. We talked to other funders and said, why aren't you funding these organizations? These are amazing people. And they said, it's too complicated, this issue. We don't know how to navigate, when we talk to organizations, we don't know which ones we should fund. We don't know who's doing work. They all tell us we should be prioritizing different things. So that lack of a collective voice, that lack of a common vision had a real world consequence. And that was really what led me and a couple of other people to think about starting something new. And that was to zero. And that's what I do now. So when I get up in the morning, those are the kind of problems I think about. Okay. How do we build that collective voice? How do we give voice to the people, to your listeners, to anyone who cares about this issue? How do we give them the voice?
Oh, retweet. I hear it. And I think it's so important that you've taken us on this journey, because there'll be a lot of people who want to get into this sector. And myself, I was one of them a few years ago, and I had no idea what I was getting involved into. I saw a gap. I saw that there wasn't enough of these conversations happening in an approachable way. I have a background in design. I really thought there was something we could do to create events and public education programs that had more of an oomph to them. And I just naively thought, this is going to pop off. I'll get some money from somewhere, and then I'll become super successful and everyone will be talking about it and we'll change the needle on the way we talk about childhood sexual abuse. We're 3 years in. I'm only just getting to the point where I might be able to secure a year of salary for myself.
Yeah.
And outside of that, I've been doing all of this work on a voluntary basis. I've met so many people who have been doing that for the past 20 plus years. And whilst I've really seen like the impact that our small community has, I also see how much work there is to do. And it's consistently a battle of, how much am I gonna consistently put myself through this, recreating a schedule every day with a change of plan because we have such little resources, when I have to remind myself of the big vision of why we do this. And so I thought today is such a valuable conversation, because we have one of the people like myself, which I would say is on the ground doing this work, someone like yourself who's come from a funder background but then also into research. And it's a great example of the different ways that you can work on tackling childhood sexual violence, which don't necessarily involve going through any particular sector or path.
Yep.
I just wanted to mention how we met. So we both attended the conference in Colombia, which was the Global Ministerial on Ending Childhood Violence. And you were launching the report that 20 has written, which we will talk about in a moment. I was giving a speech about that talk, and there was something about us where there was just a buzz in the way we were both truly throwing our heart into what we were saying. And I think it's quite bold, because given the reality, given the stats on childhood sexual abuse, you know, globally it's like 1 in 5 girls, 1 in 7 boys. Some of the stats are 1 in 4 as well. Like, it can feel really hopeless that we're tackling this issue. And when I saw you up on the stage, genuinely saying and meaning, I think we can get to 0 with tackling this issue, I was shook. I was like, this is ambition in its rawest form. And then we started talking, bish bash bosh, led to this podcast. And I think there's a lot of powerful conversations we can have about the types of sectors involved in childhood sexual abuse as well, which I think goes really nicely into your report. Could you tell us a tiny bit about the 20 report? And because you spoke to over 330 organisations as part of this,
That's
didn't
right.
you?
Yeah.
Wild. My throat is getting dry just thinking about that.
So, yeah, absolutely. And I remember well us in Bogota, and that kind of connection that just seemed to happen. When we started with a belief, Sophia, a fundamental belief we felt would be bold, ambitious, and transformative. And that belief is that this is a preventable issue. I do not accept that this has to be the way the world will be going forward. I don't accept that. And it isn't just a belief, because we have really strong evidence starting to build around things that will work to significantly reduce sexual violence against children. So, the belief is there, the commitment is there, but also importantly, the evidence is there. And so what we wanted to do is say, okay, if that lack of this collective voice, this collective vision, a roadmap for all of us, not just each of our individual organizations, if that's one of the key things that unlocks progress, and as we talked about, unlocks funding, let's actually create space to have a conversation to build that together, that roadmap and that vision. And that's what we did. And so we spent 18 months. We talked to over 330 leaders, and they were everything from people working on grassroots organizations, to campaigners, to advocates, to policymakers, to solo activists, all of the things, to researchers. We brought everyone into that conversation. And this wasn't a case of sitting down and sending out an online survey and, kind of getting some boxes ticked. This was sitting in a room with people and actually working through that conversation with them. And our job, Sophia, was not to write a report. Our job was not to kind of give our perspective on this. Our job was to give space for all the people on the ground doing the real work, to give their voice some visibility, to bring that voice together. And that's the 2.0 report. It's called A Vision to Zero. It's available on our website, 20.org.
When we were coming up with titles for this episode, we were wondering, should we talk about working in the CSA sector or should we talk about collective action? And I know this is something that you care very deeply about. And I was wondering if you could explain a bit more about what collective action looks like in practice.
Collective action for me does not mean that every time we do something, we have to do it sort of with lots of different people, or we have to include in the work that we do everyone's perspective. But one of the things you did say, Sophia, is that when you started in this work, you started with the assumption that no one wants to see sexual abuse of children, right? And I think that's absolutely true. Anyone who works in this issue doesn't want to see. Now, we may have different perspectives on where we think either the most impact is going to be, or the kind of groups of people that we think are most, let's say, demand our attention, and that we need to work with, who are the kind of priority groups. So some people will have very strong views around working with perpetrators. Either they think that this is going to be a really critical long-term strategy if we actually want to prevent this from happening in the first place. And I think, again, there's broad consensus that if you really want to stop this, if you want to end this as a kind of public health issue, the long-term strategy, the long-term play has to be focused around prevention. We don't want to be in a position where we're really good at responding to this after children have experienced it. We don't want children to experience it in the first place.
Yeah.
So if we think about that, the people have strong views. I think what we're saying and what we're looking and what we started to build is this sense that you may be doing something or taking an approach that doesn't work for me for whatever reason, whether that be from kind of the experience I've had, whether that be from my belief system, kind of from kind of the social norms whatever the reason, it's okay. If that's where you need to be doing your work, that's where you need to do your work. This is where I need to do my work. So if we think about this as a kind of like a mosaic, right? Okay. In order to really solve this problem, we need to build that picture. And that picture is small little colored tiles that you're going to put onto the wall to build up this big picture. Each one of us was one of those tiles. The picture is incomplete if we got pieces missing. So each of us has a role to play. And we don't have to do or agree with everything else that everyone else is doing. But what we do agree on are, firstly, this is preventable and we need to stop it. We do agree that if we're going to do stuff, I think it's reasonable, and I don't see anyone disagreeing, saying, look, we've got evidence of what works. So let's make sure that we build our approaches on the evidence rather than just making this up or guessing as we go along. That isn't a very effective strategy, right? Okay. Let's make sure that institutions, both private and government and state institutions, are held accountable. Because this isn't simply a bad apples, a set of bad people. There's institutions can either, allow this to happen or not take appropriate measures to prevent it from happening. And they need to be held accountable as well. Okay. I think everyone agrees on that. Everyone agrees that digital spaces should be built with children's well-being in mind. We agree that we need to shift social norms away from silence and stigma. This issue has a huge stigma associated with. One of the reasons Secrets Worth Sharing is so powerful is it is absolutely addressing that stigma challenge, right? It is saying, actually, we just need to have a conversation about this. And if someone has that lived experience, if someone has experienced this, why should the shame be on them? It's incredible. It is incredible. The shame should be on the perpetrator. And yet we have this stigma still that lingers. I think everyone agrees that that needs to change.
One thing I find is a lot of people come to me and they want to get involved in helping to end childhood sexual abuse, but they don't know how. And that's not down to them. Like, I find that a lot of the time, especially when I was growing up, if you wanted to do something around children or sexual harm, the only options were to be a frontline worker at a charity or become a therapist or become a social worker. I would be terrible at all three of those things. I think I'm terrible at crisis management. I would also panic. I would overthink. My space is definitely more within the advocacy and workshop area. But I just wanted to take this space now for you to share what are some of the many ways people can get involved in helping to end childhood sexual abuse, and how can so many of those become paid professions or organisations in themselves?
The first thing I would say is that for some people who have lived experience, taking that step to openly disclose is, firstly, I would say, a very brave step. And, there's lots of ways that can then help move our collective agenda forward. It can really make a difference. It can really make an impact. I do want to stress, and I know you feel exactly the same, Sophia, that no one with lived experience should ever feel under any pressure to publicly disclose. That is, it is going to be right for some people and not for other people. Mm-hmm. And both are equally legitimate. And even people who are non-publicly disclosed, many of those work in our field or our sector as well, and do amazing work. And so I think, as I say, it just depends on the individual and where they are on their own healing journey and what's right for them. You could kind of join an organization, join a charity, you could I'm a social worker, you could, kind of work with children. I think actually one of the most interesting things that has happened over the last couple of years is that you don't necessarily need to do that, but to have a huge impact. And the way people have what I've seen is that the voice of publicly disclosed survivors, they've actually found a collective voice. So I'm thinking of, things like the BRAVE movement. So the BRAVE movement is this global movement of survivors who talk publicly and advocate for this issue. And I think that has done a huge amount of good. And I think it does a couple of things. One is, we talked earlier in this podcast around the issue of stigma and how childhood sexual violence still has a stigma associated with it. I think the more people just talk about this openly and talk about it and say, this was my experience, but I am comfortable in sharing that, and I don't feel that this is something I need to hide. I think that makes a huge difference in terms of starting to kind of chip away at that stigma that our societies have built up around this. The second thing is the legitimacy of the voice of survivors is incredibly powerful. This is people who know and exactly the impact of sexual abuse has, and aren't just talking about the impact it had on them, but talking in a very powerful and a very kind of a thoughtful and strategic way around what needs to happen so other children don't have to experience what they've experienced. And it's amazing, actually, when you get that voice, what can happen. So, for example, I just talked about the BRAVE movement, and the BRAVE movement is one example. There's many other examples of survivor voices, maybe not at the global level, but at a more regional or national level as well, and groups. And BRAVE is actually setting up groups at country level, within a number of countries around the world.
One of the things that often comes up with people who work, I want to say professionally in the sector, but I guess what I mean is that they are known for their labour in working in this topic. Some people, for example, therapists or people who are survivor engagement roles, which means their job is to kind of collect together the people telling their stories and make sure that they're accommodated and facilitated for. Yeah. Sometimes those people are survivors too, but as you've said, they're undisclosed. And sometimes they say, yeah, I don't want to tell everyone that I'm a survivor because I feel like then all of a sudden a switch will flip and I've just become a survivor and my professionalism is no longer important, or my work as a survivor advocate is meaningless because it feels like I'm just doing this to appeal to the survivor side of me. And I think it's really important to recognize that regardless of if someone discloses, you're often wearing a lot of different hats at once, you know? Like when I tell people that I run a nonprofit that focuses on childhood sexual abuse, people are like to me, oh my God, every single day for you must be absolutely traumatic and exhausting. And I'm like, no, genuinely not. Like, yes, I work on some difficult topics, don't get me wrong, but some of the harder parts of the job are securing funding or advocating for getting a team and then training that team or finding a venue that can accommodate for us. You know, a lot of problems that someone who's working in any other field would also have. It's just, I'm also dealing with this topic, which is such a taboo. And the reason I say that is because often in these spaces, we have a lot of skills that are linked but unrelated to our experiences of being a survivor. You know, some of the most helpful people that have helped me on my journey have never spoken about childhood sexual abuse publicly before, but they might be a chef and they've been able to provide catering for one of our events, or they might be a graphic designer who could volunteer sketching out some logos. You know, there's always a way that you can take part in these conversations. You mentioned accountancy firms before. You know, there is a financial burden on childhood sexual abuse, and there are many reports which I'll link that talk about that. You know, and so even having a conversation about what is actually needed from workplaces to support their workforce, especially when they might be survivors, and how can we create a safer workplace that doesn't just cater for survivors of childhood sexual abuse, but all forms of violence. Like that should be a standard workplace discussion and issue. So, you know, a lot of people say they want to help and feel the needs to support survivors, but feel like the only way to do that is to get involved as a therapist, a social worker, or work in a charity. I could never be a social worker. I think I would make a terrible social worker. I wouldn't have any of the connections. I think I'd really struggle in that crisis environment. Where I'm best is using the design, the pop culture knowledge, talking about it from an education and advocacy point of view, you know? And there is, just as you said at the beginning, there are so many different ways that you can tackle this issue under the umbrella of wanting no more sexual harm to children.
This came up in one of our conversations, actually. This idea that if someone is publicly disclosed, if they are a survivor, that label is somehow given, that's the label they have, rather than the professional experience and expertise they have. So people saying, you know, who have we got in the room? Well, we've got someone who's a real, you know, a comms expert. We've got someone who is a lobbyist and, you know, kind of campaigner. You know, we've got a social worker. We've got someone, you know, a therapist. Oh, and we've got a survivor. And it's almost like the survivor is so all of their everything else that they bring to the table is sort of just thrown away, and the label they're given is survivor.
Yeah.
And I mean, so I think what you said is what we've heard as well, which is that, you know, there's a power in that public disclosure, and there's a legitimacy and an immediacy, a kind of a demand for action. For action from all of us, from all of society, when survivors speak. But being a survivor is not the defining characteristic of the person. It is one part of who they are and their life experience. They are professionals. They are as competent as any other professional in their chosen profession. When we say we are listening, or we aspire to listen, are we doing that in a meaningful way? And are we seeing those people as full people? Or are we just seeing them with a label on their head, bringing them in, getting them to give an opinion, and then almost being tick box about it and say, well, okay, we've had that input, now let's go away and have the real conversation.
I always say this, I should start tattooing it on me. I think there is nothing more dangerous than a person with many resources who thinks they are doing the right thing. You see it time and time again that because they are often either in a position of power or have funding resources or are a senior in whatever work role it is, but that they want to end childhood sexual violence, that any decision that they make is therefore a good one because they have that overarching goal. And I think because of the lack of public conversations that we have on childhood sexual violence, those of us in the field often learn this the hard way, right? So to go back to the example about public disclosing and survivors' voices, you know, I have people to protect. I have loved ones who I don't want to drag into my public story about what happened to me. I'm aware that what I'm doing by going down this field cannot ever be erased. You know, even if I decide to become, I don't know, a landscape architect into 3 years' time, you could very easily find out my history of abuse from going through this, through going through my search LinkedIn or whatever.
Yeah.
And, you know, that is a disclosure that you can't take back. And I very much made a point early on to not share the details about what happened to me. And by that, I mean the actual graphic nature of the abuse, who did it. I do talk sometimes about how people close to me responded, because I think that's a really educational tool, but I don't think that you need to justify what happened to you in order to be believed as a survivor. And I often find that because I'm somebody who is willing to talk about my story and my work to an extent, that I consistently get pushed a little bit further and further in media spaces where they're like, oh, but what exactly happened? Oh, who exactly did it? And, you know, it can be really difficult, and sometimes you are caught off guard. Or as a professional, as an organization director, I might turn up to talk about childhood sexual abuse in one sense, and then very quickly get pivoted to talking about, oh, what happened to you when you were a child? So we need to also recognize the nuance and the duality of holding many of these identities at once, because you can't just split someone out based on one thing that happened to them and use that to disregard all of the professional experience that they have built since then. They're very, very linked together. Sean, I was wondering if you could tell me some of the common challenges that you came across when people were working in this sector.
One of the most powerful insights was around the perception that people see at times, not just outside the sector, but even within the sector, that this is inevitable. And actually, I think a lot of the challenges root themselves in that feeling of inevitability, that incorrect, that erroneous feeling of inevitability. I mean, just think about it. If you think that this can't be solved, there's implications just flow out of that. So if we think that it can't be solved, is there a really strong push to start focusing in and investing in prevention? Well, if you think it can't be solved, probably not, right? And so what we do is we actually allow this to happen again and again and again, or it happens again and again. If you think it can't be solved, are you going to get funders and supporters and policymakers to come in and actually do the work that they need to do to support the sector and support all those amazing people who are doing this work? Probably not, or definitely not to the same extent that you would want, because it's always going to be here. So actually, I think, you know, kind of some of the challenges for me, one of the biggest challenges, and one of the things that we really need to tackle, is that sense of inevitability or fatalism. And I think we need to change the narrative on this. I think we clearly need to talk about how pervasive this is. 1 in 5 girls and 1 in 7 boys globally experience sexual violence before the age of 18. Yeah. Okay. I mean, that is a shockingly, appallingly, you know, kind of bad statistic. What we need to do is take that platform, that understanding, that insight, and build off it. And we build off that in a couple of ways. One of the ways we build off it is by looking at what works, what we know actually is going to make a difference, okay? There's a great initiative called Safe Futures Hub that has done an evidence review. Over 70 different interventions, evaluated those rigorously to see what actually is going to make a difference in terms of how we can tackle this problem. And like some of the stats coming out of that are just like really, really amazing. You know, there's a parent app that is a cost-effective digital tool that works with caregivers to prevent and respond to violence against children. And in Tanzania, where they've rolled out this parent app, it's had transformative impact. It's reduced sexual violence by about 67% reduction. Girls' vulnerability to sexual violence has gone down by 17% and boys by 18%. So, you know, these are the sort of things that can really make a difference. So understand the nature of the problem, really important. Understand what works and actually have a process and sort of commit to backing evidence-based solutions, not just what we would like to do or we think feels good to do. And the last thing I think is going to be really important is changing the narrative. Start talking about this in a different way. And the way we need to change that narrative is it needs to transform from a narrative of fatalism to a narrative of hope. We need to talk about this as something that we can solve, something we can do. We have had global initiatives before where we have been able to we've been able to eliminate diseases. We've been able to change, make significant progress in terms of empowerment of women in many communities, right? We've been able to, start having an ongoing conversation. We aren't anywhere close to it yet around violence against women and girls, but we're making progress and we're changing the narrative, and we need to change the narrative around this issue as well. And so I think actually, when we talk about the challenges, one of the challenges is and this does come down to us working in the sector as well, to start talking about this and building that narrative of hope when we talk about this.
How do we maintain that hope to keep going and to kind of recruit new people onto this cause?
Absolutely. I mean, particularly over the last sort of 6 to 8 months, globally, the funding environment has seen significant shifts. And many organizations, many sectors, many issues have had to sort of realign and adjust to those shifts. And we aren't unique in that regard. But this is we are working on a kind of a 20, 30 year, kind of time frame here. So the first thing I would say is no progress is smooth. We don't just kind of go in a straight line, right? There's always going to be bumps in the road. And I think it's one of the things I would encourage all of us to do is keep that kind of time perspective in mind. And I don't wish to diminish our sort of, downplay some of the struggles and some of the kind of the challenges organizations have right at the moment. I want to stress that they are real. And I think there will be casualties from where we are at the moment. This issue isn't going to go away. And although, some people listening to this may be sitting and saying, yeah, easy for you to say, Sean, but I don't know how I'm going to pay, the costs next month because my funding has sort of really dried up, right? And I agree. I think that, people are in a really, really difficult position. And I say, I don't want to sort of in any sense downplay or sort of de-emphasize that. When I started 2.0, when I moved from the foundation I was working with to work with 2.0, one of the senses I had was like, we're at an inflection point. We've talked a bit, Sophia, about things like, a more connected sector. Things like the roadmap, the 2.0 vision and roadmap, a vision to zero report help on that. We've talked about growing evidence base, something like Safe Future. So we've talked about the emergence of a strong survivor voice, examples like the Brave movement. Okay. I felt we were at an inflection point around this issue. I felt that whereas, there had been, it had been not an easy journey, for many, many years. We're on the cusp of some changes, and I still feel that. And here's the thing, even in the current environment, there's a group of visionary funders who, for the first time ever, have come together to form a collective initiative among 8 funders. They're calling themselves at the moment, although I think later in the year they'll come up with their, they'll launch formally and have a new kind of name. But the working title is Funders for a Safe Childhood. And this is a collective of funders whose role in setting it up is to encourage more funders to start getting behind this issue, particularly private philanthropic funds. We're in a really difficult position, and that isn't going to solve all the financial problems for everyone out there. While acknowledging that, we also have to acknowledge that is a really significant step forward. That is a really significant commitment. People who are doing their day-to-day job, they're giving out grants, they have their programs, they're thinking very thoughtfully around how they can best support this sector and this issue. And as well as doing all that, they're kind of saying, we want to take on more responsibility and more work because we are so passionate about this and we believe that this is a solvable problem that we want to expend our time and our energy and our networks and our connections to bring other people, other private funders into this space and to tell them what an impact they can have, to tell them, explain to them why we do this and why it's so important, and support and encourage them to join us. So there are seeds of hope in what is a very difficult and challenging time. There are still seeds of hope, and that's what I hold on to as well when I think about the current environment, and the fact that we aren't going away.
I really smile because you've reminded me of something that I've not thought about in a really long time, but someone very close to me who's in their 80s now, when all of Secrets was coming out and she'd found out about it, and she just said to me, I find it incredible that not only are you able to talk about what is going on and do it in such a casual way, but that there are so many other people who are willing to do the same and fight on this issue. And she was like, I'm in my 80s. When I was younger, you did not talk about this. And I think because I'm not going to say the word desensitized, because I care about every single story, but with the weight of if it was the first disclosure. But I do hear the stories a lot, and therefore it can be really easy to get into a slog of thinking, no one wants to talk about this, no one wants to think about this, I'm just fighting this uphill battle all the time. But what I have to remember is that in terms of the long scale that you've talked about, this really is a generational shift. And we're noticing it now with people who have lived decades longer than us, that things are changing. It's just, unlike the tech world, for example, the changes don't happen weekly or daily or hourly. They happen generationally over decades and decades and decades. And that is an unfortunate, but also a really refreshing part of this work, because you know that the seeds that you're planting are going to be reaped and sowed many, many years to come. You just don't quite know how. In this section, we're going to give some do's and don'ts about working within the sector. Because we're talking about working within the sector and organisations, these are more things to bear in mind when you're wanting to work alongside grassroots charity organisations, but also some of the things that we should positively be thinking about as well. So Sean, what are some of your don'ts?
Don't think you're alone, and don't try and do this work alone. We are powerful together. There are times where it makes sense to focus on what you do, and there's times it would be so much better if you came together, if we came together with others, where we can support and reinforce each other's work. And we know that systemic problems require systemic solutions. And we can't create systemic solutions if we're working in isolation.
Can I just ask you, Sean, do you have any advice for people who might be doing this work alone about where to reach out and find these opportunities?
Well, the first thing I would say is connect into the 2-0 community. We have this community of now, over 400 individuals and organizations. The people who contributed to the conversations that led to a Vision to Zero report, our vision and roadmap, but also now new organizations that have seen the power of this and want to be part of that global community. And they range from big international not-for-profit organizations and non-governmental organizations, right down to individual activists and community organizations. We hold community gatherings online every 6 months, and that is a chance for people to connect into the network and connect into each other. So a great starting point around finding those opportunities and being part of a sector, and that really, kind of living and breathing that is to become part of that community, part of our community. And I would encourage people just to go to our website. We have a contact form. Just let us know, and you're in. We would be delighted to have you.
Oh, love that. There's no gatekeeping with you guys, which is so nice. I remember when I was first starting out Secrets, honestly, I just felt like this little girl in her early 20s who didn't know what she was doing. And I'd reach out to so many organizations and say, look, I have this background and experience. I'm a survivor too. I've made this podcast. And sometimes people just wouldn't want to know unless I was a qualified therapist or if I'd had a background of working with survivors. And actually, what I will always hold on to is that back then I came with so much fresh perspectives because I wasn't bogged down by all of this. So yeah, like accepting new voices is definitely a plus. Another thing I'd say about not being alone is you'd be surprised about where people want to help. And that doesn't necessarily have to be within the sector. So, for example, I wanted to start a podcast. If I'm just yappeting alone on my own, that's not interesting for anyone. And I'm not going to be learning or teaching anyone anything. So I often reached out to people or organizations or existing charities or even people on Instagram who talked about their story. And I'd be like, hey, I know you don't work for a charity or you don't have any professional experience on this, but you mentioned a lot about your experience of child sex abuse shaping how you are. Would you be interested in collaborating? So, you never know where that collaboration could come from, and it could come from spaces you don't accept outside of the sector as well.
My second note is, don't think expertise only looks one way. So I give you some examples. I mean, one of the really interesting things is when we looked at it, and we people like Safe Futures Hub did their evidence review. The Global South has really powerful, kind of examples and leadership around things that work, solutions that work, that we in the Global North could learn from. And often, there's this sense that it can be the Global North is perceived as sort of telling the Global South how to move forward or how to do things. So I think that's one example, but also even outside our sector. So you've talked about this, Sophia, sports organizations, tech innovators, seeking social impact. The education sector, there's so much overlap between sexual violence and things like education, climate, health, justice. And so people working in those fields as well, I think we have something to offer to them, clearly, and we should, never feel that we're in a sort of a lesser position than they are. But equally, I think they will have insights and approaches and strategies that we can learn from. And I think it's that openness to sharing both ways. So don't look one way. Open your eyes and be both listening and speaking.
Speaking of collective action and harmony, I do a lot of work in Vietnam. That's where I'm from as well. And it consistently surprises me the difference between the UK approach to these issues, social issues in general, actually, compared to the way it's done in Vietnam. And in Vietnam, there's a lot more of an understanding of there are differences in opinion, but we are all striving for harmony. And you see that from the way business can be conducted all the way through to the way you turn up at a restaurant and the person working behind the restaurant isn't there because they're caring for their son. So one of the customers will get up and take your order for you. There's just a sense of collective action that I see, for example, in Vietnam, that I do not see as much here. And I went to a conference really recently on ending childhood violence, but based in the UK. And I found it so funny because not only was I one of the youngest people in the room, but everyone there had really authoritative identities. And I was like, there is no one here from the ground who's interested to learn more. It just feels very us and them. And the way the sector was talking was very us and them. Whereas when I have these conversations in Vietnam, particularly with bookshops that are interested in hosting our work and our comic books, there's a lot more of this desire for the bookkeepers who are selling the books to learn about the topic, or customers learning about how to support their friends. So I'm really glad that you mentioned that, because again, there's different ways that we can approach harmony and collective action, and those aren't always defined by the West or the global North, So one of mine is, don't assume that all organizations are the same. I am currently on a lot of panels, and I think this happens a lot where organizations, for example, the police, the Home Office, justice organizations, they really want to engage survivors and organizations that work with survivors, and they don't quite know how. And it feels like the solution is always to bring you on an unpaid panel. And I've started taking myself away from that as much. And it's really interesting because that sentiment is often hit with a lot of pushback, because they're like, but we're giving you a choice to be in this room. And I have to keep reminding people, I'm like, you are all salaried members of staff. I am doing this voluntarily in my free time. You can't live off of, you're not paying for your fish fingers with volunteered time coming to these panels, So I think we need to start remembering that, the director of the NSPCC versus somebody who's working on a very grassroots level, or are volunteering their time, or working in a very, very scrappy environment. they are going to have different levels of capacity with which they can, take part in something. And someone from a more established or larger charity, for them, salary and resources might not be an issue because they're being salaried to be there anyway, and this is a sector discussion. Whereas a lot of the grassroots sector do not have that luxury. And the reason why I think this is so important is because the model of the past, the model of, oh, let's invite everyone equally, but not take into account their different backgrounds and circumstances, that is starting to become the norm. And I really think we need to challenge that model and recognize, what does it take for each of these people to be in a room, and how can we not treat them all with equal respect, but in different levels of acknowledging the different levels of resource that they can put to this. So that is one of my don'ts. I kind of mentioned this before, but my second don't was, don't assume that every case in every country is the same. I think whilst we've talked a lot about global environments, and I would love your thoughts on this, Sean, there's also an element of the environment in every country is very different. So even if we just compare the UK and Ireland, for example, the UK is starting to have those conversations around online and technology. The UK actually ranked in the Columbia rankings with the data on childhood sexual abuse. The UK ranked 77 out of 100 in terms of their responses. And a lot of people, myself included, would say there's still a really long way to go, but we still ranked top 77 out of 100. You look at somewhere like Ireland, where a lot of the conversations that I see around childhood sexual abuse are around the Catholic Church, or the history of alcoholism, or the way that these groups have been silenced, especially by England as it is. So, even just comparing two countries that are next door to each other, we get very, very different responses. So don't assume that every case, every environment is the same. I don't know if you could talk to us very briefly about the general differences per continent when it comes to dealing with this topic.
I don't know if I know the cultural context deep enough to really talk authoritatively, but here's what I will say.
Okay.
I think we've talked a lot about this kind of collective vision and roadmap, and it applies to everyone as the roadmap. And that's true, and there's power in that. But I think what's equally true, there's cultural and social norms and local contexts. And this issue is different around the world depending on those social and cultural norms. And so we can't think about universal solutions. Everything has to be relevant to the community and the society in which we're working. And I think we can definitely talk about general principles, but we do need to contextualize and localize what we do. And again, there's this sort of, we need to be very careful about not falling into this trap of assuming, because this is how we do it here, this is how everyone else should do it everywhere else. We're building a toolkit so people can take the process we developed and take some of those general principles we've developed and actually run their own visioning process in their own country or in their own local context to come up with a much more appropriate version of what we've developed that applies to the context in which they are working and living.
Shall we move on to the do's?
So the first do, I think, if we look at this as an issue and as a sector, is do ground yourself in what works. At times we can feel a bit overwhelmed, I think, about the scale of this problem and just the complexity of how we go around tackling it. But I think it's really important to remember that we have lots of examples and lots of evidence of things that do work. So if there is, something, if we want to tackle this and there's a particular focus we have, the chances are that there's going to be people who've already tried something similar and figured some of this out, and we can build on that. So the evidence exists, the solutions are there. What we really need to do is think about bringing them into our local context, making them relevant for the communities we work with. We need to think about when we have solutions and approaches that do work, and what by working, I mean just reduce the incidence of sexual abuse of children, reduce the probability of children experiencing sexual abuse. When we see that, when we know what works. And my second do, Sophia, is sort of sounds simple, but to me is so fundamental. if there's one message I would like to kind of people to take away from our conversation today, be hopeful. Don't lose that. Everything we do is built on this hope and conviction and knowledge that we collectively can build a world where every child can grow up safe and can thrive. That is what we're doing. We are doing good work. We are doing good work.
That is a jaw-dropping way to finish. Thank you so much, Sean. I have one that is around, do remember that other people in the sector could be a survivor. The reason I say that is because there are so many times where it can be really frustrating to deal with the bureaucratic nature of running any organisation or being affiliated with anything. And I think sometimes we can risk doing the exact same thing that we advocate against, which is pitting survivor experiences against each other, or thinking, oh, this person doesn't know what they're talking about. I'm coming here as an open survivor, or I'm coming here like as someone who represents survivors or whatever. And I think we have to remind ourselves that there are many often personal reasons why people get into this sector that they might not necessarily share with us. So just remember that there are likely people who are undisclosed survivors, and always lead with grace and care. My other one is, do take a chance on bold, scrappy ideas. This is particularly for the funders. But I recently spoke with someone called Rachel, who is working on the Courage Museum, which is going to be the first bricks and mortar museum in the States that is dedicated to conversations around childhood harm, particularly sexual violence. And I'm working on a really similar thing called the Museum of Difficult Topics, like this idea that I had completely separately. And someone put us in touch, and I was like, great, I need to hear how she's done it, how she got this idea from that to bricks and mortar. And she was like to me, Sophia, I have been pitching this idea for the past 10 years. I've been doing active fundraising for 10 years until we got to the millions that we needed to build this thing. And I was like, millions? I'm still thinking in the thousands category. And she said consistently, time and time again, she'd speak to a funder, she'd speak to someone who was philanthropic, etc. And the first thing they say to her is, why are you building a museum? There's no proof that this is going to exist. But you could also argue that with so many of the initiatives that were once ignored that have now become standard practice. You know, I think about when I started my career, I started in co-design, you know, user-centered co-design. No one had heard of it. Everyone was skeptical about it. And now co-design, you can't move for hearing this word. So really take a chance on those scrappy, bold ideas, and remember that they have come from the same desire to fix a problem that you have had as well. It's just coming at it from a different angle.
Love them.
Brilliant. Oh, well, Sean, it's been an absolute pleasure chatting to you today. Thank you so much for sharing all the work that you've done. We will link everything in the description, so don't worry about that. We need more people to hear about this collective action. And I hope you have a lovely day.
Brilliant. And listen, thanks for the opportunity. Fantastic to do this. Fantastic to spend a bit of time with you.
Thank you for listening to yet another iconic episode of Secrets Worth Sharing. I'm just dropping in here now to remind you to like, follow and subscribe on all the platforms, most notably Instagram, let's be for real, at Secrets Worth Sharing _. And you know the score. If you want updates on any of the resources, links mentioned here, blogs, media and links to our events, go to our website www.secretsworthsharing.com. Also, rate this podcast, ideally 5 stars, give it a like on YouTube. All of that really helps us to drive up funding so we can keep producing this iconic, engaging and community minded material. And with serious joy, bye.